The blade sliced through the icy air as the rising sun painted the horizon red. Two warriors, exhausted and bloodied, faced each other over the stained snow. At their feet, Astrid Thor's daughter watched with cold eyes. One of them would fall that morning. Only the victor would claim her hand, but she already knew which warrior would never see the next sunset. Thank you for joining us in this story. Our channel is just beginning, and every subscription means the world to us. It helps keep this project alive as we aim for our first 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoy the tale and want to see more, please subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support truly makes a difference. The cold had seeped into every corner of Ravenholm, a small coastal village carved out of the rugged edge where jagged cliffs met the restless sea. The ground beneath was frozen hard, a thick crust of ice and snow that crunched sharply under the footsteps of those who dared to walk its hardened paths. The wind came swift and biting, carrying with it the briny scent of salt water mixed with the faint, smoky aroma of wood fires burning in hearths across the settlement. The sun, low and pale in the sky, fought against the heavy gray clouds that pressed down like a shroud, as if the heavens themselves mourned the weight of the long winter yet to come. Among the weathered wooden houses, smoke curled lazily from crooked chimneys, rising slowly to vanish into the chilly air. The structures leaned and creaked under the strain of the season, their walls thick with moss and lichen, patched with layers of mud and straw to hold out the cold. Narrow paths lined with rough stones linked the cabins, the uneven cobbles slick with frost that threatened to steal a man's footing if he was not careful. Ragnar Haraldsson moved through this frozen world like a shadow born of stone and ice. At 32 winters, his presence was a fixture of the village as much as the pine trees that stretched toward the sky or the endless rhythm of the waves crashing below. His heavy boots left marks in the snow as he walked the perimeter, eyes sharp and alert despite the way exhaustion clung to his muscles like a second skin. The wind tugged at his dark brown hair, pulling strands loose from the braids that framed his face, and sent his thick cloak billowing behind him. His face, marked by the passage of countless battles, looked stern against the pale bleakness of the day. The deep blue of his eyes seemed almost unnatural in their intensity, piercing through the cold haze like the blade of his war axe. A scar, jagged and unforgiving, carved across his left brow and cheek, told a silent story of survival and pain. At his neck hung a simple iron amulet shaped like the rune of Tyr, the god of war and justice, a steady reminder of his lineage and the promises he bore. The air was filled with the muffled sounds of the village's daily rhythm. Somewhere nearby, a hammer struck an anvil in a steady, deliberate beat, the clinking echo reverberating against the wooden walls of the smithy. Children's laughter, muffled by thick woolen cloaks and scarves, drifted faintly from a cluster of boys and girls chasing one another across a frozen pond, their faces rosy from the sharp air and exertion. The scent of fresh bread baking wove its way from the communal hall, mingling with the distant cries of seabirds circling overhead. Yet beneath this veneer of ordinary life, tension churned like a brewing storm. Ragnar's footsteps slowed as he reached the edge of the village. Here, the sea stretched out endlessly, a slate-gray expanse roiling beneath an overcast sky. The jagged rocks that jutted from the shoreline seemed like the broken teeth of some ancient beast, their surfaces slick with seaweed and ice. The wind whipped harsher here, tearing at Ragnar's cloak and biting at the exposed skin of his face and hands. He clenched his jaw against the onslaught, his gaze scanning the horizon with a soldier's vigilance. For 3 years, the village had been spared the horrors of raiders and invaders. Yet the memory of past bloodshed lingered, haunting the edges of every conversation, every glance exchanged in the firelight. Ragnar bore the weight of those memories like a second skin, thicker than his furs and more persistent than the winter cold. His mind drifted, as it often did, to the promise he had made long ago. Leif Thorson had been his closest friend since childhood, a companion forged in the same hardships, trained to fight side by side, and share the unspoken bond of warriors who had seen too much death together. When Leif had sailed off with a band of raiders into the unknown, Ragnar had vowed to protect his family should the worst come to pass. The days had turned into months, and the months into years, with no word of Leif's return. Now, that promise shaped every choice Ragnar made. It was a silent oath carved as deeply into his heart as the scars on his face. As he turned away from the shore and began the slow walk back toward the center of the village, the cold seemed to press in tighter, biting through his layers. His breath came out in thick clouds, fogging before him like fleeting ghosts. The sound of footsteps behind him made him pause and glance over his shoulder. A young scout, breathless and wide-eyed, approached with news of distant movements, nothing immediate, but enough to kindle a flicker of unease. Ragnar nodded, his expression unreadable, but his mind already racing through preparations. The village needed to be ready, even if the threat was but a shadow on the horizon. Closer to the heart of Ravnholm, the village square lay quiet. A few figures huddled around a fire pit, exchanging low voices sprinkled with laughter that felt fragile in the cold. The wooden benches were frosted over, the smoke from the fire swirling upward in lazy spirals. The smell of burning pine and damp earth mingled with the ever-present scent of the sea. Ragnar's gaze shifted naturally toward a small cabin near the communal hall, its windows faintly glowing with candlelight. This was where Astrid, Thor's daughter, lived, a woman whose presence stirred something deep within him, something he fought to keep buried beneath layers of duty and restraint. Astrid was more than just a widow in the eyes of the village. She was a symbol of endurance, of quiet strength beneath the fragile veneer of grief. Her golden hair, often braided with care despite the hardships, caught the firelight even through the frost-covered window panes. Her eyes, blue-green and piercing, held stories of loss and survival, a fierce determination that commanded respect. Inside her cabin, the loom sat ready, threads stretched taut, weaving the fabric of both livelihood and legacy. The rhythmic clack of the shuttle through the warp was a steady heartbeat in the otherwise still space. Tonight, however, the sound was absent, replaced by the soft murmur of Astrid's voice as she spoke quietly to her young son. Bjorn, just 5 winters old, was a child born into a world tempered by hardship but softened by the warmth of his mother's care. His pale hair was a tangle of light, his cheeks flushed with the rosy glow of youth. In his small hands, he clutched a wooden horse, an heirloom carved by his father, that had become his talisman against the cold and the shadows. Astrid's gaze lingered on the boy as she brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. Her hands were worn and marked not by battle but by relentless work, delicate fingers that had transformed threads into cloth and woven love into every stitch. Yet, beneath her quiet strength, a storm raged, a storm of uncertainty and guarded hope. The door creaked softly as Ragnar stepped into the dimly lit space, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. His movements were deliberate, respectful, the weight of his promise evident in every careful step. Astrid looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of surprise and something unspoken passing between them. "Herbs from the forest," he said quietly, placing the bundle on the table. "They will ease Bjorn's cough." She nodded, accepting the gift with a subtle grace. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond forged through loss, loyalty, and the fragile threads of something more. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, rattling the shutters and stirring the coals in the hearth. Smoke curled into the rafters, carrying with it the scent of burning pine and dried herbs, grounding them in the reality of the harsh world beyond these walls. Ragnar's eyes searched Astrid's face, searching for a sign, a hint of the woman beneath the widow's mantle. She met his gaze steadily, the weight of years pressing between them like an invisible barrier. Have the others noticed? She asked softly. Ragnar's mind drifted to the day ahead, the gathering of the warriors, the possibility of war whispering in the wind. Yet, beneath his resolve, a quiet hope stirred, a hope that perhaps, in the midst of ice and shadow, something warmer might grow. As the night deepened, the village settled into uneasy rest. Fires burned low, and the watchmen took up their posts along the palisades, eyes sharp against the darkness. The sea roared its eternal song, indifferent to the struggles of men. And beneath the frozen sky, Ragnar Haraldsson stood vigilant, caught between the promise he made, the weight of his scars, and the uncertain path that lay before him. The night pressed down upon Ravnholm with a weight that seemed almost tangible, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The firelight inside the small cabins flickered and danced against the rough-hewn walls, casting shadows that stretched and shifted like restless spirits. Outside, the cold gnawed relentlessly, its icy fingers creeping beneath doors and through the cracks in the wood, whispering of the dangers that lurked beyond the fragile safety of the village. Ragnar Haraldsson sat near the dim hearth in his modest dwelling, the low crackle of flames barely warming the space. His thoughts were tangled, swirling with the memories of promises made and lives lost. The flickering shadows played across his scarred face, highlighting the deep lines etched by years of battle and burden. His hands, calloused and strong, rested on his lap, fingers tracing the familiar shape of the iron amulet, Tyr's rune, that hung ever-present at his neck. It was a symbol of duty and justice, yet tonight, it felt heavier than usual, as if the gods themselves challenged the choices he faced. His mind wandered to Astrid, Thor's daughter, the woman whose presence had become an unspoken thread woven tightly into his life. She was the widow of Leif, his closest friend, a bond sealed not merely by grief, but by a promise, a vow to protect her and her son, Bjorn. That promise had been a burden and a beacon, guiding Ragnar's steps through years of uncertainty. But now, as the tension between him and Eirik Sigurdsson deepened, the path ahead seemed shrouded in shadow. A sudden knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. He rose, muscles stiff from the cold and the weight of his thoughts, and opened the heavy wooden door to reveal a young woman, her face pale and drawn under the flickering torchlight. Her breath came in shallow puffs, visible in the frigid air, and her eyes held a desperate urgency. Ragnar Haraldsson, she gasped, clutching the edge of his tunic with trembling hands. Please, your help is needed. A child, lost beyond the woods. He studied her for a moment, noting the fear etched deep in her features. The village was small, and everyone knew one another's faces, but he did not recognize this woman. Her clothes were worn and dirt-streaked, suggesting she had traveled some distance through the harsh night. "What child?" he asked, his voice low but firm, a tension surfacing beneath his calm exterior. "A boy," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. "Perhaps no older than your Bjorn. He wandered from his family's farm during the last storm. They fear he was caught in the blizzard, but I saw him, near the edge of the forest, alone." Ragnar's heart tightened. The very thought of a child, so small, so vulnerable, lost to the merciless cold stirred a fierce, primal protective instinct within him. Yet, a part of him recoiled, knowing the dangers that lurked beyond the village's palisades. The forests were home to wild beasts and worse. Raiders sometimes used the cover of night to strike. To venture out now meant risking not only himself, but potentially others who might join the search. "Why come to me?" Ragnar asked, his gaze searching her eyes. "I heard your name," she said, voice barely audible. "They say you keep your promises, that you do not turn away from those in need." The weight of her words settled heavily on him. His promise to Leif was a vow to protect, yet the cost of keeping such promises had often been steep. The line between duty and survival blurred in the cold darkness. Ragnar hesitated for a long moment, wrestling with the turmoil inside. To stay meant safety, for himself, for the village. To go meant risking everything for a stranger's lost child. But then, the memory of Bjorn, safe and warm in Astrid's care, surged to the forefront. The boy's bright green eyes, so full of innocence and hunger for life, pierced through the shadowed doubts. Could Ragnar turn away from a child in peril? Could he bear the weight of another life lost, knowing he had the strength to prevent it? He stepped aside and motioned for the woman to enter. "Tell me everything you know," he said quietly. "We leave at once." Inside, the woman, who introduced herself as Ira, a traveling healer, unfolded a tale that sent a chill deeper than the winter's bite. The boy, named Halvard, was the son of a neighboring farmer's family. He had been adventurous, curious beyond his years, and had slipped away during the last storm, lured by the distant glow of a fire or perhaps the call of the wild. His family had searched in vain, their hope fading with each passing hour. Ragnar listened intently, his mind already planning the route. The boy's last known position was near the thick woods to the north, a place where the trees grew dense and the shadows deepened. The cold had been fierce, and the storm had left the landscape treacherous, but the boy's survival depended on swift action. Ira gathered what supplies she could, wrapped bundles of herbs, strips of cloth, and a small flask of mead for warmth. Ragnar donned his cloak, secured his axe, and prepared for the journey ahead. The night was still and oppressive, the silence punctuated only by the distant howl of wolves and the whisper of pine needles in the wind. As they stepped beyond the boundaries of Ravnholm, the familiar safety of the village gave way to the wild unknown. The forest loomed, its ancient trees standing like silent sentinels watching over the frozen earth. Each step crunched beneath their boots, the snow hard and unyielding. The cold bit sharply at exposed skin, seeping through layers of wool and leather. Ragnar's senses sharpened. Every rustle of branches, every crack of ice beneath foot, sounded amplified in the stillness. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, not only for the lost child, but for the fragile hope that a life could be saved. Ira's breath came in quick, steady puffs as she kept pace, her eyes scanning the darkness. "You are far from the fighting now, warrior," she said softly. "But this search, it is a battle of a different kind." Ragnar nodded. Some fights cannot be won with steel alone. They pressed deeper into the woods, guided by faint tracks partially obscured by fresh snow. The trail was difficult, twisting among gnarled roots and fallen branches, forcing them to move carefully to avoid injury. At one point, a low growl echoed through the trees, and Ragnar tensed, hand moving instinctively to the haft of his axe. Ira squeezed his arm, her eyes calm but alert. "Wolves," she whispered. "They are near, but wary. We must be cautious." Minutes stretched into an hour, the cold gnawing at their resolve. Ragnar's thoughts turned again to Bjorn. How easily a child could be lost in such a harsh world. He felt the familiar ache of guilt and fear, the same emotions that had haunted him since Leif's disappearance. Suddenly, a faint cry pierced the night, a fragile, desperate sound that sent a jolt through them both. Ragnar's heart hammered as they hurried toward the source, the branches parting to reveal a small figure sprawled against a fallen tree, shivering violently. "Halvard!" Ira exclaimed, rushing to the boy's side. The child's face was pale, lips blue from cold, but his eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice. Ragnar knelt beside them, his breath ragged, but his relief immense. The boy was alive. "Can he walk?" Ragnar asked, concern etched in every line of his face. Ira shook her head. "Too weak. He must be carried." Without hesitation, Ragnar lifted the boy gently, feeling the fragile weight against his chest. The child's breath was shallow, but steady, and his small hands clung weakly to Ragnar's tunic. The journey back was slow and arduous. Every step demanded careful balance, every movement calculated to protect the fragile cargo. The cold seemed to intensify, and a thin layer of frost formed on Ragnar's beard and cloak. The forest, once merely ominous, now felt suffocating, a cage of ice and shadow. For a brief moment, the harshness of the world softened, and the promise of something more, protection, care, perhaps even love, took root amid the frozen landscape. The night's ordeal had revealed not just the dangers that loomed beyond the walls, but the strength found in choosing to stand for those who could not stand for themselves. Yet, as the village slowly awakened beneath the pale light, Ragnar knew the true battle was yet to come. Between him and Eirik, between duty and desire, the stakes were higher than ever. But for now, in this fragile breath between darkness and dawn, he had chosen to protect life, no matter the cost. The cabin door creaked softly as Ragnar stepped inside, the faint warmth of the hearth wrapping around him like a fragile shield against the biting cold outside. Ira moved with quiet purpose, guiding the shivering boy deeper into the room, where a bed of furs lay spread near the fire. The dancing flames cast flickering shadows across the wooden walls, illuminating the worn tools and simple furnishings that spoke of a life lived with measured hardship. Bjorn, Astrid's son, peered curiously from the corner, clutching his wooden horse tightly. The child's wide green eyes reflected both the awe and the wariness that comes with witnessing unfamiliar faces and the intrusion of strangers into the sanctuary of home. Astrid hovered near the fire, her face pale but steady, her gaze moving between Ragnar, Ira, and the frail figure bundled in ragged cloth. Ragnar knelt beside the boy, careful to shield him from the cold draft that slipped beneath the door. His rough hands, scarred but gentle, untied the knots securing the threadbare cloak wrapped tightly around the child. The boy's limbs trembled, his breath shallow and quick, and Ragnar could feel the fragile pulse beneath his thin skin. Iris set about gathering water from a wooden bucket near the hearth, heated slowly over the fire. She returned with a small wooden bowl filled with a warm, milky porridge made from barley, simple sustenance, but enough to coax life back into the weakened child. Ragnar helped to lift the boy's head gently, brushing a strand of frost-dusted hair from his pale forehead as the boy opened his eyes with a faint, uncertain flutter. The boy's gaze was hesitant, but when Ragnar spoke softly in the old tongue, his voice low and steady, the child's lips parted slightly in recognition. "Halder," the boy whispered, a name barely audible beneath his breath, the sound fragile like a leaf on the wind. Ragnar caught the word, though its meaning lay veiled in mystery, a fragment of a story yet untold. Astrid moved closer, her eyes searching the boy's face with a mixture of concern and quiet hope. She reached out, placing a warm hand on his cheek, the gesture delicate yet filled with strength. "You are safe here," she assured him, her voice a soothing thread woven through the heavy silence. Bjorn, emboldened by the presence of another child, stepped forward cautiously, offering the wooden horse as a tentative gift. The boy's fingers twitched, reaching out to touch the smooth carved surface as a faint flicker of recognition passed through his weary eyes. For a moment, the two boys shared a silent understanding, an unspoken bond forged in the quiet space between fear and trust. Ragnar watched the exchange, his heart tightening with a protective instinct that ran deeper than mere duty. The boy's clothes were tattered and stained, the mark of hard times and long journeys. A thin scar traced a pale line along his wrist, an old wound, faded but not forgotten. Around his neck hung a crude amulet, carved from bone and worn smooth by years of handling, its form strange and unfamiliar to Ragnar's eyes. The child's lips moved again, mumbling words in a dialect that bore the tint of distant lands, words that held echoes of a homeland lost and a path fraught with peril. Ira translated quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is from the northern settlements, far beyond the fjords we know. His family was caught in the winter's wrath, and he escaped alone." Astrid's eyes darkened with sorrow, but also with resolve. "He will not be alone here," she vowed. "Not while I live." Ragnar reached out, offering the boy a small wooden cup of warm water. The child's fingers closed weakly around it, his pale lips trembling as he sipped slowly, the liquid bringing a faint glow of warmth to his chilled body. The room was filled with the soft sounds of breathing and the crackle of the fire, a fragile sanctuary carved from the harshness of the world outside. As night deepened, Ragnar took up a worn cloth, dampened with herbal tinctures Ira had prepared, and gently began cleaning the boy's face, careful to avoid disturbing the fragile skin. Each stroke was deliberate and tender, an unspoken promise that here, in this humble cabin, the boy would find refuge. The scent of pine resin and dried herbs mingled with the faint warmth of ember and sweat, wrapping the space in a cocoon of earthy life. Bjorn climbed onto the bed beside the boy, nestling close with a protective instinct that belied his tender years. Astrid moved to the loom, her fingers restless as she wove threads of wool into the fabric of the night, the rhythm steady and grounding. Her eyes occasionally lifted, watching the two boys with a mixture of maternal care and cautious hope. Ragnar remained near the hearth, his thoughts heavy with the weight of the promise he had made to Leif, and the new promise he was beginning to forge, to protect not only the widow and her son, but now this lost, fragile child who had stumbled into their lives. His gaze drifted to the amulet at the boy's neck once more, wondering what stories it held, what path had led this child through the frozen wilderness to Ravnholm's door. The hours slipped by, marked only by the soft sighs of sleep and the occasional murmur from Ira, who tended the boy's fever with quiet skill. Outside, the wind continued its relentless song, rattling shutters and stirring the snow, but within the cabin, a fragile peace had taken root. Ragnar found himself drawn repeatedly to the boy's side, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the faint twitch of lips and fingers in dreams. He recalled his own childhood, the reckless days of youth shared with Leif, days when the world was vast and full of promise, unshadowed by loss or duty. Now, those memories felt distant, like echoes from another life, yet they fueled the fierce determination that burned within him. In a rare moment of stillness, Astrid approached Ragnar, her eyes searching his face. "You carry more than scars," she said softly. "You carry the weight of others' lives, too many to count." He nodded, the lines of his face deepening with the burden. "It is the warrior's curse, to protect and to suffer." Her hand brushed against his arm, a touch that grounded him amid the swirling storm of thoughts and fears. But also the warrior's honor. For a moment, their gazes locked, a silent understanding passing between them. It was a fragile bridge between past and future, built on loss, but reaching toward hope. Bjorn stirred, his eyes blinking open to find Ragnar watching. The boy offered a shy smile, clutching the wooden horse close. Ragnar returned the smile, a rare softness breaking through his usually stern demeanor. "Sleep well, little one," he murmured, voice low and steady. "We will keep you safe." Outside, the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, a pale, cold light brushing the horizon with fragile strokes of pink and gray. Within the cabin, the fire sputtered low, casting long shadows that danced gently across faces marked by weariness but touched by the fragile light of new beginnings. As the village slowly stirred awake, the fragile bonds forged that night held fast, threads woven through acts of care and moments of quiet trust. In the heart of Ravnholm, amid the cold and shadow, the promise of protection had grown into something more profound, the fragile, enduring spark of hope. The news traveled faster than the winter winds, slipping through the dense forests and scaling the jagged cliffs that cradled Ravnholm. In the flickering glow of hearth fires beyond the village's boundaries, whispers of the lost boy's rescue stirred unease and intrigue alike. The fragile threads of peace that held the coastal settlement together began to fray, pulled taut by eyes that watched from shadows and voices that carried hidden intent. Ragnar Haraldsson felt the first tremors of this shifting tide before the full weight of it revealed itself. When the dawn's cold light painted the village in muted grays and blues, Ragnar stood within the great hall of Ravnholm, its heavy wooden beams creaking under the weight of the long winter. The fire pit at the center spat embers that danced like restless spirits, throwing flickering shadows onto the faces gathered around. Warriors, elders, and villagers alike crowded the space, their voices low and tense as Halvard was brought in, wrapped in furs and supported by Eirik's steady hands. Astrid stood close, her eyes never leaving the boy, her hands clenched tightly by her side. The tension in the room was palpable, thickening the air like the smoke that curled from the hearth. Ragnar caught her gaze, her determination mirrored in his own. The village jarl, Halvard Gunnarsson, a man worn by decades of harsh winters and fierce battles, rose from his carved chair. His voice, gravelly yet commanding, cut through the murmurs. "We have all heard the news," he said, eyes scanning the room with a measured gaze. "A child lost in the wilds, found and brought safely home. This is cause for relief, but also caution. The world beyond our walls is a storm we cannot ignore." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged worried glances. The fragile peace Ravnholm had maintained felt suddenly fragile, a thin veil stretched over simmering tensions. Ragnar stepped forward, his voice steady. "The boy is safe because we acted swiftly. We cannot turn away from those in need, no matter the risk." Halvard's eyes bore into him. "And yet, Ragnar, risks have a way of bringing more than aid. Word travels, and with it, the eyes of those who would use our kindness against us." A shadow flickered past the entrance as a messenger arrived, breathless and bearing a sealed scroll. The jarl took it, breaking the seal with deliberate fingers. His eyes darkened as he read the hastily scrawled message. "Bandits and raiders are stirring beyond the northern passes," he announced grimly. "They have heard of the boy's rescue. Some believe he carries secrets, or that his family holds land worth claiming." The hall fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the news settling like a stone in the pit of every stomach. Eirik Sigurdsson, leaning against a pillar with his arms crossed, stepped into the flickering firelight. His dark eyes gleamed with a mixture of calculation and restrained aggression. "This changes everything," he said softly, voice laced with menace. "Ragnar's actions, however noble, have drawn a line in the snow. The question is, can Ravnholm hold it?" Ragnar met Eirik's gaze with a cold steadiness. "And if it does not, what then? Will you stand with your neighbors, or watch as the walls fall?" A murmur of agreement followed Ragnar's words, but Eirik's smirk hinted at a challenge unspoken. Outside, the cold wind howled, rattling the wooden shutters and stirring the snow into swirling eddies. The village's defenses, once a source of quiet confidence, now seemed fragile, vulnerable to forces gathering beyond sight. That night, as the village gathered what weapons and provisions they could muster, Ragnar found himself walking the perimeter once more. The amulet of Tyr hung heavy at his neck, a cold weight that matched the burden in his heart. His eyes scanned the dark horizon, where the sky met frozen land in a line as thin and brittle as the peace they clung to. The thought of Astrid and Bjorn waiting behind the walls tightened his chest, sharpening every sense. Ragnar knew that protecting them meant facing not just the harshness of winter or the threat of bandits, but the growing tension within the village itself. Old grievances, rival ambitions, and fears stirred beneath the surface, threatening to unravel what little harmony remained. As the firelight flickered in the windows behind him, Ragnar's breath misted in the cold air, a fragile promise hanging between the frost and the stars. The next morning, the village woke to the low rumble of horns echoing from the cliffs. Scouts had returned with word that a party of strangers approached, riders cloaked in furs darker than the night, bearing weapons etched with foreign runes. Their presence was a clear sign. The world outside Ravnholm's fragile sanctuary had shifted. The threat was no longer distant, It was at their gates. Within the great hall, the Jarl convened a council. The villagers, warriors, and elders crowded together, the air thick with unease. Plans were debated with urgency, voices rising and falling like the tide. The fragile balance of trust and caution teetered dangerously. Eirik's presence loomed as he argued for a preemptive strike, his words sharp and persuasive. Ragnar countered with a call for unity and vigilance, urging the village to stand together rather than fracture under fear. Astrid sat quietly among the women, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames as if seeking answers in their restless dance. Bjorn sat beside her, clutching his wooden horse, his wide green eyes reflecting both the fear and curiosity that gripped the village. Outside, the riders crested the hill, their dark forms silhouetted against the gray sky. The banners they bore fluttered weakly in the wind, a silent warning that nothing in Ravnholm's world was as certain as the turning of seasons. Ragnar's hand rested on the haft of his axe, fingers tightening as the weight of his promise pressed down anew. To protect Astrid, to guard Bjorn, to defend the fragile hope that had sparked amid the cold. This was the path he had chosen, no matter the cost. As the riders approached the village gates, shadows lengthened across the snow, and the world held its breath. Ravnholm was no longer a quiet refuge. It was a battleground where loyalty, honor, and survival would be tested by the cold, the knives of men, and the unforgiving hand of fate. And at the heart of it all stood Ragnar Haraldsson, warrior, guardian, and reluctant bearer of a promise that could either save his people or shatter them forever. The dawn crept slowly over Ravnholm, its pale light filtering through the heavy gray clouds like a reluctant herald of what was to come. The village stirred beneath the weight of a restless, uneasy night. Fires burned low in hearths, casting flickering shadows that danced uneasily on frost-covered walls. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that tightened throats and pressed cold against the chest. Outside the sturdy wooden walls, the land lay cloaked in snow, a brittle white silence stretching toward the horizon. The jagged cliffs stood sentinel over the restless sea, their unyielding faces carved by wind and wave, a stark reminder that nature's fury was as relentless as any man's. Within the great hall, the atmosphere was far heavier than the chill that seeped through the cracks beneath its massive doors. The gathering of Ravnholm's warriors, elders, and clan leaders was no longer a customary council, but a crucible of fate. The weight of impending conflict pressed upon every soul, the flickering torchlight reflecting in eyes that had seen too much and yet feared what was still to come. Jarl Halvard Gunnarsson sat upon his carved wooden throne, his age-lined face grave, the scars of many battles etched deep into his weathered skin. His missing fingers curled tightly around the haft of his ancestral sword, a silent testament to sacrifices born in the name of this land and its people. The room held its breath as he rose, his voice steady but laced with the authority of a man who carried the burden of leadership. "We stand at the edge of darkness," he said, his gaze sweeping the assembly. "The raiders approach, and with them comes the test of all we hold dear. Our walls may be strong, our warriors fierce, but the storm gathers beyond these palisades." Murmurs rumbled through the crowd, a mix of fear, resolve, and simmering tension. Ragnar Haraldsson stood among the warriors, his broad shoulders squared and stance unyielding. His scarred face betrayed no sign of doubt, yet beneath the surface, the storm within roared louder than ever. The promise to protect Astrid and Bjorn, the fragile peace between him and Eirik, and the looming shadow of death converged upon him like the tide before a fierce storm. Eirik, raven-eye, Sigurdsson leaned against a pillar, his sharp gray eyes calculating, scanning the faces around him. The wound in his chest from the last battle throbbed faintly, a reminder of his own mortality and the stakes at hand. His presence was a constant challenge, a shadow that neither he nor Ragnar could fully shrug off. The rivalry between them had become more than a contest. Astrid stood apart, her gaze steady and unwavering as she watched the men debate. Her thoughts swirled like storm clouds, torn between fear for her son's safety and the quiet determination that had carried her through the darkest days. She knew that the battle ahead would test not just the strength of warriors, but the resilience of hearts. Bjorn clung to her side, his small hand gripping hers with a fierce, protective grip. The boy's wide green eyes held a mixture of innocence and a budding courage that belied his years. He was a living testament to hope amid despair, a fragile flame flickering against the cold winds of fate. As the council reached no clear accord, the heavy doors of the hall creaked open to admit a breathless messenger. His cloak was stained with mud and blood, his face pale but urgent. "The raiders have broken camp," he reported, voice strained. "They march toward the southern fort, less than a league from here. They come with fire and steel." A hush fell over the hall, the weight of the news pressing down like a winter gale. Halvard's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening around the sword's haft. "It is time," he declared, voice resolute. Ragnar exchanged a sharp glance with Eirik. No longer adversaries divided by desire alone, they now stood as the village's shield and sword, bound by necessity to face the storm together. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant echoes of war cries and the ominous thrum of hooves pounding across frozen earth. The villagers hurried to their posts, the clang of hammer on metal and the shouts of preparation ringing through the cold air. Astrid moved swiftly among the gathered women and children, her voice calm but firm. "Stay close within the hall. Bjorn, hold my hand tight. We will see this through together." Her eyes met Ragnar's across the icy courtyard, a silent pledge passing between them. There was no place for hesitation now, only the raw, unyielding will to survive. The first clash came with a brutal force that shook the wooden walls to their foundation. Raiders surged forward, their battle cries piercing the air like jagged blades. The warriors of Ravenholm met them with a roar, steel ringing against steel, the sickening thud of bodies colliding, and the sharp scent of blood mingling with smoke. Ragnar fought with a fierce desperation, every strike fueled not just by skill, but by the fierce need to protect what he held dear. His axe cleaved through the snow and flesh, his scarred face set in a grim mask of determination. Beside him, Eirik moved like a shadow, his blade finding weaknesses with deadly precision despite his wound. The battle stretched beyond the village gates, spilling into the frozen earth. Flames licked at the wooden palisades, casting orange light across faces twisted in pain and fury. The cries of the wounded mingled with the clash of weapons, the air thick with the bitter smoke of burning wood and the metallic tang of blood. Amid the chaos, Astrid held Bjorn close within the great hall, her heart pounding in time with the thunder outside. She could feel the tremor of the earth, the roar of battle like a living thing pressing against the walls. Her thoughts raced, a tempest of fear, hope, and fierce determination. She knew that beyond the walls, two men fought not just for survival, but for something far more fragile, the future of a family, a village, a promise. Ragnar's voice rang out amidst the clamor, rallying the defenders. "Hold the line. For Ravenholm. For those we love." Eirik's blade flashed, cutting down an attacker who lunged too close. His breath came ragged, the wound in his side stealing strength, but his eyes shone with relentless fire. In the heart of the battle, a moment came when fortune seemed to waver. A group of raiders broke through a weakened section of the palisade, pushing toward the great hall where Astrid and the children waited. Ragnar caught sight of the breach and surged forward, a primal roar rising from his throat. Eirik followed, moving with grim resolve despite the pain. Together, they formed a bulwark, driving back the invaders with a ferocity born of desperation. Ragnar's axe swung in wide arcs, each blow a vow to keep what was sacred safe. Eirik's sword danced with lethal grace, a storm of steel and shadow. When the last raider fell, silence descended like a heavy shroud, broken only by the crackling of dying flames and the labored breaths of the living. Ragnar's gaze found Astrid across the courtyard, her eyes shining with a fierce, unyielding light. Bjorn stood beside her, small but resolute, a symbol of all they fought to protect. Eirik staggered beside Ragnar, clutching his side, his face pale but unbowed. "Your courage," he gasped, voice rough. "It saved us all." Ragnar inclined his head, the weight of the battle pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Today, we fought as one," he said quietly. "May this day be remembered not for the scars it left, but for the strength it revealed." As the sun climbed higher, melting the frost and casting long shadows over the battered village, Ravenholm began to breathe again. The fires were tended, the wounded cared for, and the fallen honored with solemn reverence. In the quiet aftermath, Astrid approached Ragnar, her steps sure despite the weariness in her eyes. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "Not just to my family, but to all of us." Ragnar looked into her eyes, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. The promise that had once been a burden now felt like a path forward, one forged through fire, blood, and something more profound. "Not all promises are chains," he replied. "Some are the forge where honor and love are tempered." She reached out, her hand brushing his scarred cheek, a touch both tender and fierce. "Then walk this path with me," she whispered. "Not as a duty, but as a choice." Ragnar's heart, heavy for so long, lightened in that moment. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile dawn. And as the village of Ravenholm began to heal, so too did the hearts of those who had fought to protect it, bound not just by promises past, but by the hope of all that was yet to come. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Ravenholm began to stir with a quiet urgency. The village, still raw from the previous day's battle, bore the marks of survival and sacrifice. Smoke curled sluggishly from the chimneys, mingling with the frosty breath of dawn, as the villagers moved with a weariness that only came from nights spent on edge. The cold had not lessened, but beneath the frost, a fragile warmth had begun to take root, a hope reborn amid the ruins. Ragnar Haraldsson sat by the embers of a dying fire outside Astrid's cabin, his body aching from wounds both seen and unseen. The wound Eirik had received had stirred something unexpected in him, a recognition of shared mortality, a grudging respect that had begun to ease the tension between them. But it was Astrid's presence, steady and unwavering, that grounded him now. Her hands, though worn from toil, held a quiet strength that filled the space between them like a tether to something more enduring than battle. Bjorn played nearby, his laughter a fragile melody against the harshness of the season. The boy's bright green eyes, so much like his father's, followed Ragnar with the innocent trust of a child who had glimpsed safety in the midst of chaos. Ragnar's gaze softened as he watched, the weight of his promise lifting momentarily under the lightness of that trust. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind, the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the moment when he had chosen to spare Eirik rather than claim victory in blood. That choice had been a turning point, not just in the battle, but in the silent war waging within him. Honor, he realized, was not measured by the fall of an enemy, but by the strength to show mercy when it was hardest to give. Astrid approached slowly, her footsteps quiet on the frost-hardened earth. Her eyes found his, a steady flame that held no trace of the grief that had once cloaked her like a shroud. Instead, there was something new, an openness that invited connection without demanding surrender. "You carried him back," she said softly, nodding toward the direction of the great hall where the injured still rested. "Eirik Sigurdsson, I did not expect such mercy from you." Ragnar's jaw tightened reflexively, the memory of his hesitation sharp and raw. "He fought beside me," he replied, voice low but steady. "Not all battles are won with hatred." Astrid's lips curled into a faint smile, the corners lifting as if the weight of loss that had so long defined her was finally easing. Perhaps that is the truth I needed to see. Her words hung in the cold air like a prayer, a plea forged from the depths of her experience and pain. Bjorn, sensing the shift in mood, ran to her side, clutching her hand tightly, as if anchoring himself to the possibility of peace. Eirik's dark eyes softened as he looked at the child, then back to Astrid. You have my word, Thor's daughter. My loyalty will no longer be a weapon turned inward. Ragnar nodded quietly, the tension that had gripped his shoulders loosening. And mine. The Jarl, Halvard Gunnarsson, appeared at the doorway of the great hall, his weathered face creased with lines carved by time and battle. His gaze swept over the trio, and then to the gathering villagers, a mix of warriors and families bound by the shared scars of conflict. This day has tested us all, he said, voice heavy but resolute. We have seen bravery and mercy both. Let it be remembered that the strength of Ravenholm comes not only from the skill of its warriors, but from the courage to forgive, to stand together. The villagers murmured their assent, the harshness of the season softened by a collective breath of relief. The wounds of the body would heal in time, but the wounds of the heart required something more: patience, understanding, and the willingness to embrace the fragile threads of reconciliation. In the days that followed, the village moved toward a tentative peace. The palisades were repaired, and guards kept vigilant watch through the long nights. Ragnar found himself spending more time at Astrid's side. Their conversations no longer weighed by grief or obligation, but by a growing connection that neither had dared to name aloud. Bjorn thrived in this new calm, his laughter ringing through the cabins like a balm to weary souls. He began to learn the ways of the village once more, tutored patiently by Ragnar in the skills of the warrior, not for battle alone, but for the honor and protection it required. Eirik, though still marked by his injury, took on a role that surprised many. He became a mediator between the clans, his sharp mind and calculated nature channeled not toward conquest but toward building alliances. The same eyes that had once gleamed with ambition now looked for ways to secure a future where bloodshed need not be the price of survival. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Ragnar and Astrid stood overlooking the frozen sea. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the faint song of distant waves, a reminder of the relentless world beyond their fragile sanctuary. Astrid reached out, her hand finding Ragnar's with a certainty born of trials endured together. You honored your promise, she said, voice soft like the twilight. Not just to me or Bjorn, but to something greater. Ragnar's gaze met hers, the fierce blue of his eyes tempered by a newfound warmth. It was never just a promise of protection, he replied. It became a promise of hope. The snow beneath their feet was pure and untouched, a canvas waiting for new stories to be written. In the distance, the faint glow of the village lights flickered like beacons against the coming night, a testament to resilience and the enduring spirit of those who called Ravenholm home. As the stars emerged, cold and brilliant, they stood together, no longer bound by duty alone, but by a bond forged in fire and tempered by mercy. The dawn that awaited them was uncertain, but for the first time in many winters, it held the promise of peace. And in that promise, Ragnar Haraldsson found not just redemption, but the beginning of something rare and precious, a chance to build a life not defined by loss, but by the courage to choose love. The winter's grip slowly began to loosen its hold on Ravenholm, though the chill still lingered in the air like a stubborn ghost. Days stretched longer, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, its pale light casting a gentle glow over the snow-covered village. Smoke rose steadily from countless hearths, carrying the scent of pine and burning wood, a quiet song of survival and renewal. Beneath the frost-crusted roofs and weathered timbers, life stirred with renewed purpose. The scars of battle, both visible and hidden, remained etched upon the village and its people. The palisades bore fresh marks where splintered wood had been reforged, the handiwork of skilled craftsmen and eager hands alike. The wounded had been tended with patience and care, the dead honored in solemn ceremonies beneath the ancient oaks, where the wind whispered songs of the fallen. Yet, amid these signs of loss, a new strength blossomed, a fragile kindling of unity and hope. Ragnar Haraldsson moved among his people with a quiet solemnity, the weight of his promise now transformed from burden to blessing. His broad shoulders, once burdened by grief and duty, now carried the steady confidence of a man who had found his place beyond the battlefield. His eyes, deep and sharp as ever, held a new warmth when they met those of the villagers, especially when they settled on Astrid and her son. Astrid, Thor's daughter, had become a figure of steadfast resilience, her presence a beacon in the village's slow recovery. Her hands, though still marked by the toil of weaving and care, no longer trembled with the quiet sorrow of loss. Instead, they bore the calm authority of a woman who had reclaimed her life and her future. Bjorn, bright-eyed and lively, continued to grow under their watchful eyes, his laughter threading through the village like a promise of brighter days to come. It was a morning like many others when Ragnar found himself at the edge of the village, standing beneath the ancient pines that stood as silent witnesses to countless seasons. The snow beneath his boots was softening, a pale carpet melting into the earth, and the wind carried with it the scent of thawing wood and distant seas. He breathed deeply, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs, steadying his thoughts. Nearby, a figure approached, a stranger to most, but now woven into the fabric of Ravenholm's story. The boy they had rescued from the frozen wilds, Halvard, had settled into the village with a quiet strength that surprised many. He was no longer the frightened child lost among the trees, but a young boy learning the ways of the clan, his steps growing steadier with each passing day. Halvard stopped beside Ragnar, his pale face flushed with effort, a wooden practice sword in his hands. His eyes shone with determination, a reflection of the warrior's spirit kindled in him by Ragnar's patient tutelage. "I am ready," Halvard said, voice steady, though edged with youthful uncertainty. "To learn, to protect, to belong." Ragnar looked down at the boy, a faint smile touching his lips. "You already belong, Halvard. That is the first lesson of any warrior." Their shared gaze held a quiet understanding, of past trials overcome and the promise of future battles faced side by side. Back in the village, Astrid moved through her daily tasks with the grace of someone who had found her footing amidst the shifting currents of life. Her looms sang beneath her fingers, weaving threads of blue and silver into fabrics that carried the colors of the sea and sky. The brooch she wore, once a symbol of sorrow, now gleamed as a quiet emblem of endurance and love. Her eyes, once distant and guarded, now held the soft light of a woman who had found peace within herself. Bjorn, ever curious and lively, toddled near her feet, clutching his wooden horse with a fierce protectiveness. His small hands were eager to learn, and his eyes often sought out Ragnar, the man who had become a steadfast figure in his young life. The bond between them was unspoken but profound, a living thread connecting past, present, and future. That evening, as the village gathered beneath a sky dusted with stars, the great hall was alive with the warmth of community. The fire pit at its center crackled and glowed, casting dancing shadows against the high wooden beams. Men and women, young and old, shared food and stories, their voices weaving a tapestry of connection and resilience. Jarl Halvard Gunnarsson sat among them, his weathered face softened by the quiet satisfaction of a leader who had seen his people endure and grow stronger. His gaze rested on Ragnar and Astrid, the pair whose journey had become emblematic of Ravenholm's own struggle and rebirth. The Jarl's voice rose in a toast, gravelly yet filled with heartfelt conviction. To those who stood when the shadow fell, he began. To those who fought with steel and mercy. In the days that followed, Ravnholm embraced change. The old ways persisted, honored and respected, but new traditions took root, rituals born from the trials they had endured together. The duel at dawn, once a symbol of conflict, transformed into a story told by the fireside, a lesson in honor tempered by mercy. The villagers spoke of Ragnar's choice to spare Eirik not as weakness, but as strength, a testament to the kind of leadership that bound community and kin. Astrid, too, found her place reshaped. Her role as a widow had evolved into that of a mother, a leader, and a keeper of the village's heart. She taught the children not only the craft of weaving, but the importance of choice and courage, the bravery to love and to let go. Bjorn thrived under the watchful eyes of those who cared for him. His small hands learned to grip a sword, guided patiently by Ragnar. His laughter echoed in the halls, a sound that stitched wounds invisible to the eye. One quiet afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with soft hues of gold and rose, Astrid and Ragnar stood at the village's edge, watching the sea's endless dance. The waves whispered secrets carried from distant lands, timeless and unyielding. Astrid's voice broke the silence, soft but sure. We have survived the winter's storm and the storms within ourselves. What comes now is ours to shape. Ragnar's gaze lingered on the horizon, where sea met sky in a fragile line. A new beginning, he said. Not free from hardship, but filled with the strength born of what we have endured. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining in a quiet promise not spoken aloud, but deeply felt. That night, as the village slept under a sky blanketed with stars, the firelight in their hearts burned steady and bright. The promise Ragnar had made to a fallen friend had blossomed into a legacy of hope and belonging, not just for Astrid and Bjorn, but for all who called Ravnholm home. In the cold silence of the northern wilderness, life had taken root anew, a fragile thread woven through loss, honor, and the enduring power of mercy. The dawn would come again, as it always did, bringing with it the chance to build a future not dictated by the shadows of the past, but by the courage to embrace the light. And so, beneath the endless vault of the sky, Ragnar Haraldsson, Astrid Thorsdottir, and the village of Ravnholm stood together, warriors of heart and soul, ready to face whatever the turning seasons might bring. The story was far from over, but in that moment, it was enough that they had found each other. The fires glowed dim to a soft ember warmth as the long night deepened over Ravnholm. Shadows stretched and whispered across the wooden walls of the cabin where Ragnar Haraldsson sat alone, his silhouette a stark contrast against the fragile light. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tracing the worn iron amulet of Tyr at his neck, a symbol heavy with meaning and memory. Outside, the wind sang its endless lament beyond the frozen pines, a mournful song that had echoed through the ages. In that quiet stillness, the weight of all that had passed settled upon him with a profound clarity. The battles fought, the promises made and broken, the lives spared and lost. Each was a thread woven into the tapestry of his existence, a tapestry stained with both blood and grace. He thought again of Astrid, her steady gaze that had pierced through his armor of duty and pain. She was no prize to be won, no possession to be claimed, but a force of nature, unyielding and true. To stand beside her, not as a conqueror, but as an equal, had reshaped something within him. The promise to protect her and Bjorn was no longer a shadow of a fallen friend's debt. It was a living bond forged in fire and kindness. The duel at dawn, their final, desperate dance on the snow, had revealed not only the strength of their blades but the depths of their hearts. When Ragnar lowered his sword and spared Eirik, he chose mercy over pride, honor over ambition. It was a moment that rippled beyond the frozen ground beneath their feet, shifting the currents of fate in ways a man could not predict. Eirik's retreat into the waning light had been silent but unmistakable, a concession not just of defeat, but of respect. For all his cunning and fury, the Raven Eye had seen the truth in Ragnar's restraint. And in that truth lay the fragile hope of peace, tempered by the understanding that rivalry need not end in ruin. Ragnar's thoughts drifted to Bjorn, the boy whose small hands gripped the wooden horse carved by a father who would never return. The child's laughter had become a balm to the village's wounds, a reminder that life endured beyond sorrow. Protecting Bjorn was more than safeguarding a lineage. It was preserving hope, the fragile ember against the encroaching cold. Outside, the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, brushing the snow with delicate hues of rose and gold. The village stirred slowly, the rhythm of life beginning anew amid the scars left by war and winter. Smoke curled from chimneys, mingling with the crisp air, carrying the scent of pine and burning wood. Astrid stepped onto the porch of her cabin, the weight of recent days etched softly on her face. Her hands paused on the wooden railing as she looked toward the rising sun. The brooch in the shape of a raven caught the light, shimmering like a silent guardian. Her eyes held the quiet strength of one who had weathered storms without losing herself. Ragnar joined her moments later, the footsteps muffled by fresh snow. They stood side by side, two souls bound not by fate alone, but by choice. Their breaths mingled in the cold air, visible as fleeting clouds that dissolved into the morning. "You kept your promise," Astrid said, her voice steady yet touched with something gentler than gratitude. Ragnar's gaze met hers, the scars on his face softening in the dawn's glow. "It was never just a promise," he replied. "It became something more, something I chose to carry." She looked out toward the sea, the endless waves whispering secrets of distant lands and forgotten times. "The past shaped us," she said softly, "but it does not have to define us." He nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep within him. The burdens of guilt and loss had given way to the possibility of a future built on respect and love. Behind them, Bjorn's voice echoed faintly from within the cabin, a bright, lively sound that pulled at their hearts. The child was a living testament to survival and renewal, a symbol of the village's enduring spirit. Ragnar took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs like a cleansing tide. The journey had been long and harsh, marked by shadows that threatened to consume, but also by light that refused to fade. In the stillness, he understood that true strength was not measured by the battles won or the enemies fallen, but by the capacity to forgive, to protect, and to choose hope over despair. The sun climbed higher, casting a golden path across the snow-covered ground. The village of Ravenholm woke to a new day, scarred, yes, but alive. Its people carried the lessons of hardship etched into their bones, but also the resilience that had always defined them. And in the heart of it all stood Ragnar Haraldsson, no longer just a warrior bound by duty, but a man who had found purpose beyond the sword. Beside him was Astrid, whose courage and grace had kindled a fire brighter than any forge. Together they faced the uncertain dawn, ready to build a life not dictated by the shadows of the past, but by the promise of all that could yet be. As the morning light spilled over the cliffs and mingled with the breeze, a raven soared high above, its dark wings cutting through the sky, a timeless symbol of wisdom, transformation, and the unyielding spirit of those who dare to endure. In that moment, beneath the vast northern sky, it was clear, the greatest battles are not always fought with steel, but with the strength to choose mercy, to embrace love, and to forge a legacy that transcends the coldest of winters. And so, the story of Ravenholm continues, etched in snow and memory, carried forward by those who dare to hope. If this tale of honor, resilience, and unexpected love has touched your heart, join us on the next journey. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and become part of the saga as it unfolds. For in the enduring spirit of the Vikings, every story is a thread in the great tapestry of human courage, and every voice, a light against the darkness. Until the next dawn, may your path be guided by the wisdom of the ancients and the fire that burns within.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.